There are many reasons I left Silicon Valley for the green pastures of Colorado. But one of the most important was that there were not more VCs like Phin Upham. Phin is a no BS guy. He tells it straight, he tells it like it is. Phin is a friend of Lendit FinTech. He's spoken at many of our conferences in the past, and most recently, he was part of a panel discussion titled, How VC Investors Are Responding to the Crisis. This video is a spotlight on Phin Upham to give you a sense for who Phin is as a person and as an investor. In this first cut, Phin explains what this moment of COVID is like for entrepreneurs.
When I was in college, there was a social psychology class in which they took 20 of us and dumped us into a neighborhood about 40 miles away from the school with no IDs and no money. And they asked us to survive for 3 days, which didn't go well. Um, and if you ever watch the TV show The Island, which is actually a really good show right now, they throw they throw 20 people onto an island with nothing but their clothes and ask them to survive for a couple of weeks. And I think the current environment kind of reminds me of those two scenarios. You have a bunch of people who only existed in fintech when things were good and you could get venture capital money, and it was all about like bluff and marketing and like getting out there and asking for stuff, and like your valuation was your negotiating point. And now we're now we're in like the island, and there's nothing. You have to figure out your own stuff. And so I think bootstrapping and being a real entrepreneur and chewing leather and all this stuff are characteristics that none of these quote entrepreneurs end quote have dealt with for a long time, and the VCs are not going to save them.
So what's really changed here in the past 3 months?
Like, you could typify the last decade of venture capital as a bull market in monopolies or big companies and a bear market in everything else in some way, because the bigger winners have taken so much of the value. And I think the biggest problem the big tech companies and the big fintech companies had was that they couldn't hire enough people in San Francisco. You couldn't build in San Francisco. They had all this government and regulatory pushback on what they were doing as they were getting to scale and becoming monopolies. And I think a lot of that has gone away. Like now we see somehow in the last 3 months, tech companies have gone from being the bad guys to being the heroes and the saviors. They've gone from not being able to scale enough in San Francisco to having this ideal solution for them, which is they can just hire remote people and have no physical location for them. So in this weird way, I think there's this thing called the Matthew principle from the Bible, and it's that those who have get more and those who have not, even that is taken. And I think that this is going to be a winners win more and a losers lose more. And so I'm kind of scared for VC in the sense that like I don't think like I think it's going to be a lot harder to start a VC. I think it's going to be a lot harder to start a startup. I think it's going to be a lot easier if you're an existing startup to like do stuff. I think banks have the ability to throw their balance sheets around right now. And so I think it's going to be a tough, lean time. And I think there's going to be a lot of struggle.
To put a point on that, Phin points out that coming back down to earth is going to be a meaningful change for fintechs across the world.
And I think we've all seen so many excesses and sloppiness and grandiose visions of fintech. I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see how things sort of come back to the core beliefs and the core value adds of the sector, and what that means for partnerships with incumbents, what that means for growth, what that means for funding, what that means for profitability.
Next, Phin focuses on the impact of COVID on startup valuations and what's been damaged as a result of our current economic crisis.
So on investing in general, I'd say the early stage valuations I think were the most out of whack. That is, they're the least tied to economic reality, and they're the most tied to what's going to happen in the next round. And so if you think you're going to get an up round with lots of capital, you might pay more because you figure, hell, I'll just, I'll double my my equity stake that I would if I invested later. And I think with so much uncertainty, the early stage rounds get a real knockdown valuation. So I think that's where it's going to be affected most. The later stage companies that are some of them are being massively benefited if they did remote work. Some of them are being really hurt if they were in travel. But in general, I think that like the valuations there adjust more rationally based on economic reality instead of on sort of fear. But the early stage ones I think are a fear game.
COVID has been hard on some segments of fintech and banking. It's been downright brutal to others. Let's hear Phin's perspective on this.
The areas I think are hurt the most, I think the most high-flying area of challenger banks, where valuations were driven on how much money they were raising and acquiring customers expensively, and where there weren't really any substantial revenues. I think challenger banks is an area that was exciting and is now very, very, very damaged. And I don't know if they recover in any recognizable way. I think a few of them maybe partner with bigger banks, but I think the idea that challenger banks come in and take down big banks is over. I think marketplace and lending companies are super damaged. I think to Chris's point, not only should you shut down lending, but I think you question the entire lending model. And I think the advantage that banks and people with stable capital have now is so much higher. And the ability to understand default and risk, the ability to underwrite people, the ability to go meet people, it's pretty bad. So I think that space is super damaged as well.
Now, there's got to be some bright spots, correct? So, what's okay and what's still exciting?
I think payment and money transfer has always been the best part of fintech, so I think they're probably on the margin fine. And the areas I'm excited about that I'd actually look at more closely, B2B always survives every crisis because small and medium-sized and large businesses always buy. And then I think this sort of the financial inclusion slash more distressed companies, which are focused on niche and unusual or AS or sort of non-bank focused on products. Payday accelerants, underwriting non-conforming loans, structuring sales on real estate that are atypical on high margins, figuring out how to solve a debt problem in a really unusual way. Those things I'm super excited about. I think if you go for a small niche with high margins and customer acquisition costs have gone down a lot as Google and Facebook ad prices have come down, I think that's something that it becomes important.
One thing that really stuck with me that Phin said is that fintech has somehow lost its way. And a lot of the quote innovation going on these last few years is just incremental, not radically new. Here's Phin on that point.
Right, fintech has always been good when it's trying to do new stuff that's really radical and different. And I think it lost its way for a little while trying to do Me Too's or like slightly cheaper versions of what their people were doing anyway. And I think that like the way around this crisis is to try to really radically solve big problems. And I think we forgot that for a while. And I think we're being reminded of that.
Next, Phin talks about a core interest he's pursuing as an investor in this unique moment.
One core area of interest for me is culture, because I think that in a COVID and more remote world, you have a big problem of culture. How do you figure out, you can't have people in the office, you can't supervise people. So how do you trust people? How do you get people on a team? How do you build that team? And I think especially in fintech where money's involved and you can steal money and there's a lot of regulations involved, oversight and culture becomes incredibly important.
That's it. That's Phin Upham in a nutshell. A great dude who doesn't mince his words. I'm thrilled we had him on stage on Lend It FinTech Digital, and I'm looking forward to having him again. Until next time, keep up the hard work and take care.